anyway, I was saying that if your village is taken over by an armed group and you're forced at gunpoint to provide them with food or provide them with medical care, and you tell that in your story to the DHS official, then there'll be a question as to whether or not that kind of support actually would exclude you.
Okay.
Whether it's
all right.
under duress or not, and what the nature of that support was. So it doesn't go without saying. So just to say that there's a fair amount of discretion in how an asylum seeker's or a candidate for refugee resettlement, in how their story is articulated, and then there's a fair amount of discretion in how it's interpreted. And so that's why generally these stories are written, and then there's an interview, and then there's a follow-up interview, etc. So none of these, at least as far as the U.S. is concerned, none of these determinations are made sort of on a dime. They all are carefully considered. And then they're subject as well to appeal in certain circumstances.
Okay, yeah, I mean, that I certainly can see how that would make sense, because you got to check people out, and, you know, it's a process like everything else. There's going to be a little bit of red tape involved, I suppose. But actually, you know, I was more concerned, and my own writing was not so much about how the refugees are let in or how many are going to be let in to any given country, but it was just more about how they're going to be educated once they get here, so that they can actually integrate into American society. So a lot of it was based on this idea of having strong learning communities where they can interact with other people, and also to become self-reliant in this new American society and learn how to function socially here and interpret, you know, the way people act and the way they, you know, they gesture and look and all this kind of stuff. And it's all very important, because what you find, especially with women's rights and stuff, is that if these programs don't exist, the women end up staying home, and they basically end up marginalized in society. And another thing that I wanted to ask you about real quickly was, in the case, because it's a very common thing in the UK and the United States, according to my research, that these refugees experience a lot of kind of social ostracization. They experience, you know, racism and you know, all kinds of hatred and cultural things where people just don't want them here. And I was just wondering, like, if one of my students, one of my Syrian students, came over here and experienced that, would they have any recourse through the United Nations first before they contacted the U.S. government, or would they have to contact the U.S. government first?
Who are you talking about now, your students or the refugees?
Well, that's what I mean, because the English program that I was writing about was an English program that would be perhaps most usefully applied to the refugees that come to this country and their English as a second language program. And a lot of it was kind of about how you can help them integrate into, you know, job skills training programs and English programs and hobbies and all this kind of community programs, all these kind of things to get them out there and active in the environment, so they're not marginalized and just sitting in a camp somewhere. They're actually like learning and working towards getting a job that they want. And if you look at a lot of the programs that are out there right now already in the United States for refugees, and I mentioned about 4 of them in my dissertation, but just as an example, but a lot of those are already following these kind of principles of integrating them into society. But one of the things that keeps coming up is this idea of like racism, and they have a lot of pressure because people just are kind of afraid of them and they don't know, and they might think they're a terrorist, or they might have hatred for people from the Middle East or whatever. And I'm just kind of wondering how they could respond to that, because to me it's a very big issue in their learning process. Because if someone feels like really marginalized and they feel like people don't like them in that country, it's going to be really hard for them to get motivated to learn the language. So I guess my question is, like, if these people had any trouble in the United States, would they have to go to the United States first, or could they contact the United Nations and say, look, I'm having trouble in my city. Is there someone at the United Nations that can help me? Because it doesn't seem like I feel comfortable contacting anyone in the United States, because I don't want to, like, lose my citizenship or get thrown out. I just want to talk to someone and see if I can file a complaint. Is that kind of thing possible, or do you have to would they have to go through the United States first?
So, there's a whole rather elaborate structure for individuals that come to the United States. There's a difference between the refugees that are resettled here in an organized way through the resettlement program and those who are granted asylum while they're in the United States or upon arrival at a port of entry. But so refugees who are resettled in the United States come through a structure that involves, non-governmental agencies that have community groups that welcome and support the refugees. They're quite developed English language, ESL programs, helping them to get to work, looking for, providing psychosocial care. And so, I was in Kansas City a couple of days ago, and there's a structure for this. Refugees aren't resettled everywhere because sometimes the housing costs are too high, and it makes it more difficult for them to expect, to become self-sufficient. They're located in places where there are other refugees of the same nationality, or where there's a diaspora that they can, with a common language or common background, or where there are jobs in the service sector, in manufacturing, where, the English language requirements are low, at least initially. They're housed, more likely than not, if it's to be successful, in areas where it's close, where they have easy access to public transportation because they don't get a car in the first week, obviously, and where they can access their employment. So when access to English language is an absolute priority, and there's quite a bit of research, whether from the Migration Policy Institute, if you want to check them out.
Nice. Thank you so much for that. I'm writing that down right now. Migration Policy Institute. Okay.
Yeah, MPI.org.
Okay.
They've done a lot of comparative work, both in the United States and increasingly in Europe in this respect, and another organization that can give you some really, good examples of best practice and examples of what's happening is called Welcoming America, one word.org. Welcoming America is it deals with refugees as well as with immigrants, but there's a lot about refugees these days. So anyway, just to say that there's no question that access to, the kids have a right to primary school education and high school, and they're generally identified by the Board of Education, by the school principals, and, there's a capacity to receive them, and to deal with the fact that they're just learning English at that point. There's adult education opportunities as well because, the fathers and the mothers, whether it's before or after work, need to, it's hard. There's no question about it. But if refugees have problems and issues, generally they refer them to the counselors and the folks that are working with these resettlement agencies. And more often than not, there's a link through the local community to a church or a mosque or whatever, a faith-based organization that's really closely tied to the refugees or through one of their ethnic community associations. So, there are mechanisms for that that are pretty well established now, and I think work very well, which doesn't mean that refugees aren't having a hard time in some places, and that certain families are not falling through cracks, etc. But there's a real strong institutional base.
Okay. Of course you can't be perfect all the time and save everyone, but Yeah, I guess I'm more concerned about advocacy in this case because, as especially as a Syrian refugee with the current ISIS situation and all that, I think people tend to be a little bit more standoffish and a little bit more afraid of Syrians because they don't know if, you could be a potential terrorist who's just a genius at fooling everyone. And I just wonder if there was ever a case in any place that they resettled in anywhere where they experienced human rights abuses and they went to the police or they went to their organization and people just said, we can't do anything about it. Sorry about that. But in that case they felt like I really do have a case and I wish that someone could listen to me and just, at least tell me if I could have a meeting for an hour and go over everything and or if I could send them a report or something like that. Because I've had students tell me I just feel like if anything, well, I shouldn't say I had them tell me. I have in my research, I have read many of these people say I feel like if anything happens to me in the U.S., I can't say anything because I'm so lucky to be here. And also they're kind of just afraid to speak up to the American government. And I was wondering if the United Nations in cases where there's not necessarily an imminent threat that these people are going to be killed at gunpoint or something, but I mean, in a case where they're just having their human rights affected by one way or another, maybe, whatever, psychological abuse, isolation, maybe even, whatever, getting bullied or something at school. Any of these kind of things, if the school or the local police were not willing to do anything about it because of whatever reason, maybe they just don't like refugees, they don't want them in their town or whatever, and there's nowhere for them to go, would they actually, according to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which says that it is not, it says it's independent of any country and it extends across all sovereignties and all that stuff. So I'm wondering if they would actually be able to just call the United Nations and say, look, I don't feel comfortable calling anyone in the U.S. government right now because I just feel really strange, whatever, and I need to talk to someone who is an international organization that could kind of moderate for me or give me some ideas from a very objective and international standpoint without having any kind of sovereign attachment to any country. And I'm just wondering that because I think it would be such a nice helping hand for them to know that they had an international organization that would back them, even if things got bad in the United States, because I think we all know that in the United States, as good as our intentions are when we let them in, we can't protect them every second, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's nothing to stop a resettled refugee from calling me, as you just done, to say, that they have a terrible problem and that they've resorted to X, Y, and Z without relief, and they need my advice or the office's advice and support. Thankfully, that doesn't happen because in the U.S. there are so many points of contact for the resettled refugees, and you have to remember that when they get here, they are permanent residents, so they may very well look different, but I mean, welcome to America. There's a fair amount of diversity in most of the cities where these folks are being resettled, and so their points of contact are the community organizations, the resettlement organizations, and the local authorities, because after all, they're American permanent residents. They're on a path to citizenship, and they have the right to approach any local authority. And these are communities that have decided and accepted to receive these people. So, it's not that they're being imposed on the community, which doesn't mean that that everybody's happy and joyful, that everybody's welcoming. There are obviously going to be some risk that there'll be people that are opposed, because of, especially now with some of the rhetoric floating in the elections and so on. In fact, in Garden City, Kansas, the FBI uncovered a plot where people were going to blow up an apartment building where there were Somali refugees that were living there.
Oh my gosh, when was that?
Within the last couple of weeks.
Oh my gosh, I didn't hear anything about that. That's really unfortunate.
So I mean, this is about who people are, but and you can rest assured that the refugees are feeling it to a certain extent.
Yeah.
At least those who are new arrivals and Syrians, but also the Iraqis and others that who haven't yet mastered English and so on. But I dare say, with some level of confidence, that there's such a community of support for each refugee who's resettled in that through these programs,
Okay.
that they do have recourse. Now, refugees who arrive at the port of entry, whether it's John F. Kennedy Airport or San Diego border crossing, or who otherwise are already in the U.S. and make a claim for asylum and have to go through that procedure, there is less of a support network for those individuals. They may have family links, which brought them here in the first place because they arrived on their own, through their own, arrangement. So very often they do have a family link. But there isn't that kind of structured support, except for unaccompanied kids, where there's quite an elaborate mechanism in place to identify them and care for them and try to regularize their legal status one way or the other. But for the others, there is more risk. That's true until such time as their status is determined, and even then, because they're not in the program, they may not have that structured support network through the resettlement agencies that are located in 100 or more cities around the United States.
Right. Yeah, there are quite a few of these, and a lot of the English programs that are coming out now are much more geared towards getting them basically involved in a very close-knit group for their learning community, so that they're really it's kind of interesting because they did research and it showed that a lot of times people in a learning community will get along just fine, and outside of the learning community, they won't talk to each other at all. They don't like each other a bit. But when they're in their groups and their learning community, they just kind of find a way to work together, and it's kind of a magical, amazing thing happens, and you get these group dynamics, and people start helping each other, and all that stuff starts falling into place. It's really wonderful stuff. But I guess that what I'm kind of wondering is, if I did at some point in the future have a student that was having trouble, and they wanted to get in touch with the United Nations, what would their procedure be? What would they need to do? Is there some kind of a form they fill out, or?
No, they contact us through our website.
Mm-hmm.
And take it from there.
All right. I'm just wondering because in my research I had read that there was a couple of cases of new Syrian refugees in the last couple of years that had come over, and they had experienced some really bad racism. I guess they were, I don't remember exactly where they were, but I think it was kind of in the Midwest or something where there's probably not a whole lot of them, out there. And so they kind of stick out like a sore thumb compared to New York City. And when they were out there, they tried to, file complaints for a period of time, and basically nobody did anything very substantial to try to stop it and improve it. And then one of the people ended up getting injured pretty badly because they didn't have any protection, and then at that point they just had to leave the country, and I think they went to another country because they didn't really know what to do in this country because they couldn't get any help. And when I read that, I said, gee, I think if you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the very bottom of that is safety, and I would like as a teacher to be able to say, okay, on the first day, if you have any trouble, you do not have to go to the police here. You can go right to the United Nations, which is an international organization, which is not partisan to any country, and you can just talk to someone over there. You can fill out this form, and then they will get back to you. But it just seems to me when I go over the UN website, it's I mean, it's obviously very organized, but it also seems to kind of leave some leeway as far as the process, like how it goes, what happens first, what happens next. Everything, it kind of all begins with the first phone call, and you don't find anything out until later on. So I was just wondering, is there like a protocol or something? Like if one of my students was to write something and send it to the United Nations and wait for a reply, I mean, does the United Nations have an obligation to reply to them, or could the United Nations just say, look, it's not our problem. You need to talk to your group that you work with. You need to talk to immigration. This is ridiculous. We're like the last ones that you can call. You need to talk to everyone in the United States first. Is that kind of the way it would be, or would they actually just be able to go straight through the United Nations, not even talk to any Americans, and just start filing a report, and then let the United Nations be kind of an arbitrator or an advocate for them, regardless of where they live in the United States or what local, law enforcement happens to think of them or anything like that? Does
Well,
the United? Yeah. Okay.
my suggestion would be that depending upon the where and the when, that the first thing your students, if you will, would do is to see is there a local refugee resettlement agency where they could seek advice. I mean, and there are in many, many, many communities. I mean, as I mentioned, they are permanent residents, so they have the right, like anybody else, to go to the police, but they may be afraid of the police because of their personal background or whatever. But at least to check to see if there's a local resettlement agency that could give them advice. What we would do as UNHCR here, dealing with resettled refugees or asylum seekers in the U.S., is point them in the right direction to get their problems sorted out. We wouldn't ourselves necessarily directly engage. Sometimes we would, but more often than not, we would try to work with the individual so that they can, that they would be able to work with the local authority or the local non-governmental organization, etc., so that they would be able to address their problem. And the address is for UNHCR in Washington. They can go to the website. We're taking a look now at how we deal with individual requests and so on. But for the time being, it's working. It's just perhaps not working as efficiently as it could.
Well, I'm glad to hear that it's working at all. I mean, and any number of these people that we can get over to this country, I think it's absolutely the best solution, because they don't want to be there. They have nothing to do with any of that stuff. And I think if we're, reading in your document, it says it's all in the spirit of brotherhood. And I think that's very important in this country, because we're a country of ideals, and we have a constitution and a Bill of Rights. And when they come here, what I'd like to be able to provide them with on the very first day is some kind of an arbitrator or someone who can back them up.
Well, that's the resettlement agency.
But actually, what I was referring to is like something outside of the resettlement agencies, something outside of the United States, so that they would actually have like a non-biased, non-American friend that could, say, look, if the local people aren't supporting you, like maybe we can talk to the police department over there, or maybe we can do this.
That's just not how it works.
Okay, all right.
It really, it is a community-based thing, and the refugees do have friends through the local community organizations, the resettlement agencies, and there's a whole network of organizations that are just committed, whether they have the word refugee in their title or not, to providing this kind of support. And we depend upon them just as much. So, I mean, it's not as if we would call up the police department in Boise, Idaho. We could. There's nothing stopping us from doing that, but it would be much more effective for the resettlement agency to go and meet the police chief face to face. They probably know each other and talk through the individual case rather than involve the UN. But that's okay. I mean, they're not they're not mutually exclusive marshes. The point is simply that the UN and UNHCR in particular, based here in Washington without a network of contacts throughout the country in every city and town, would depend upon our friends in the resettlement agencies or through members of Congress or whatever in order to address the concerns of that individual refugee.
Okay.
So I mean, if it can start local and be resolved local, all the better. If there isn't a resolution locally, or if the refugee doesn't know where to go, then we can help orient that person, and we can work with the person to a certain extent. But finally, the problem needs to be resolved locally.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I guess the reason I understand totally what you're saying. It kind of sounds to me like the UN is too high up and has too much stuff on their plate to be able to deal with like individual cases in a town in Boise, Idaho, or something. You kind of have to delegate to smaller organizations that are more community based and know the community and know the police and know all those people. I understand that, but what I'm thinking is like, what would happen? In other words, I guess my question is, in the case that nobody in the local community, nobody could help these people, and they were just destitute and desperate, and they had no money to go even out of the country, and they just had to stay. What rights does any global citizen of any country have to ask the United Nations to investigate a human rights abuse? I mean, does any citizen of the world have a literal right to ask respectfully that the United Nations investigate something? I mean, what is the criteria by which the United Nations says, yes, we have a case here that we need to investigate, as opposed to something where they say, look, you have to go through other channels first because we don't have enough evidence or whatever?
Okay. Look, if there's an individual that's suffering a human rights abuse, then the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights or the Special Rapporteur for Detention or XYZ can engage, or so could Amnesty International for that matter, can engage at the individual level with its authorities. Now, I'm just talking to UNHCR. UNHCR, what we would want to do is if this person felt afraid in the United States or was impoverished and needed material support or suffered a cataclysmic drama and needed some kind of an emergency intervention.
Okay.
My responsibility to that individual as UNHCR, not based on, because they're refugees, so I'm not talking about human rights abuses in general. We're talking about that individual refugee or the family.
Okay.
My job would be to try to get that problem solved. Okay?
Okay.
And I would undertake, my job is to try to get that problem solved. So, I mean, I could go out there and talk to the police chief of Boise, Idaho. I could do that. I could get on a plane and talk to the police chief. But the more and most effective way to deal with this problem would be to connect that individual to the people that we know and trust will help that individual get the problem solved.
Okay. All right.
And that's what we would do. It's as simple as that. It wouldn't be passing the buck. Au contraire, it would be mobilizing the people who are in a position, who have resources and who have relationships and who have themselves either a legal or a moral or whatever responsibility to solve the problems that are facing refugees in the United States, and that's what we would do.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much for all this. This has been such a wonderful, expressive information session for me, and it answered so many questions because I'm sure, like you said, I mean, that the language is very broad, and it's kind of hard to determine what constitutes what. And I feel a little bit better thinking that, like, if I did have a student, I could say, like, well, you know what, it sounds kind of like you should go through your organization first, But if you have something you really can't tell them and you really need help, you could call the refugee or you could call the Human Rights Commission and maybe talk to someone. Maybe they could help you out. When I tell them that, what I'd like to be able to at least give them a guarantee of is that if they do file a report, there is a protocol that report has to be filed. There has to be, attended to. It has to be written down. It has to be documented so that if they, in the future, if they need to go back to it and say, look, I filed a complaint about this 6 months ago and I asked all these people, I even asked the UN and they didn't do anything. In that case, I just wonder what the protocol is. Like if somebody sends in some kind of a report about a human rights abuse, are they allowed to just say, look, we just don't handle that because that's not our job and throw it away? Or do they have an obligation, like literally an obligation through the UN protocol to respond to that human rights abuse?
Well, like I said, I can't speak for other organizations. And in the context of refugees, I guess our concerns are less with human rights abuses in the United States than they are with accessing services and, making ends meet and finding the right path to taking care of their children or getting a job, those kinds of issues.
Well, that's really good. That's really good to hear, and I'm glad to hear that, so I can tell them, there's just haven't been a lot of those kind of problems. Most of the problems are just economics or not having enough money or.
Absolutely, that's it. That's exactly what it is. I mean, and they may feel that to some extent that's because of discriminatory treatment, but that's precisely where the resettlement agencies engage because they're working with employers to create the conditions that would facilitate the employment of refugees. They're pitching the stories. They're proposing the individuals. They're trying to help them get jobs and get the English as a second language and build the conditions that would allow them to, like many, many people, make it better on their own, even though it will take time. So, on the other hand, if they're given the conditions, and the xenophobia and the problems that you mentioned, if a refugee feels, physically threatened, then, writing a letter to the UN is perhaps not the most effective track. The most effective track would be to go to their local police office, their police station, or to their priest or to their imam, or whatever, to say, I'm afraid, and I don't know what to do. That would be the most effective manner because, when you're talking about human rights abuses, as you have on, in a couple of your comments, I mean, those are abuses more often than not in the context of international law, in the context of our human rights work, where the individual is actually threatened by the state. Or by some very powerful non-state actor. And that's really not, not an apologist for the United States, but I mean, that's not the kind of problem that happens here. Here, more often than, the refugee can find access to security through state institutions, whether it's social security or physical security. They may not feel comfortable doing it on their own. They may not know how to approach the police, and they may feel that they don't have the language skills to do so.
You hit the nail right on the head. That's my first concern is that,
So I mean, that's where the local agency or the church or whatever is in a position to provide them with that comfort and that support.
Okay.
Much more effective and immediate way than my office would
Yeah,
be.
yeah. Well, I'd like to thank you so much. I'm going to go check out MPI and Welcoming America and some of the other places. And you answered 99% of my questions, so I really appreciate that.
Okay.
Thank you so much, sir.
Nice to talk to you. Good
All right. You have a great day. Bye-bye. Indeed.
Thank you for calling Amnesty. This call may be recorded. My name is Shad. How may I help you?
Hi, Chad. My name is Brian Gardner, and this is not an emergency or anything. I'm not even sure if I have the right department, but it seemed like, I don't know what they said, but I may have pressed the wrong number. I'm actually just looking to speak to someone who might have a little bit of information about kind of like how you compare to the United Nations in the way that refugees living in the United States can contact your organization or the UN, like to file complaints outside of the United States. That's kind of what I'm working on because of my research, and I'm just interested to know, like, you know, like outside of the U.S., if a refugee comes to the United States and then just having a bad time and and they don't seem to be able to get any help from the police or anything like that, as a teacher and a researcher, I'd like to be able to give them some kind of outside of the U.S. international organization that could possibly field their calls or maybe act as a liaison between these people and the other organizations in the U.S. that they feel they can't talk to. Because for me, it's really important that they have somebody objective outside of the U.S. that they can talk to that can help them. You know, even though they're living in the U.S., I can understand, because as a foreign teacher, I've lived in so many foreign countries, and I know it's really nice to have someone you know, either in the country or outside that can always help you out and kind of like with any problems.
Sure.
You have. So what's the deal with that with Amnesty? I'm just not really sure what you do.
Boy, Brian, Mr. Gardner, thanks for the help you do. It sounds like I like the way you approach the thought process here. I've got a ton of things to say, but let me see if I can narrow it down a little bit. One, you mentioned the UN. We're trying to implement the 67, charter for the UN Declaration of Human Rights. But the way we do that, it's not really like a lot of groups do. We don't have a legal team, an immigration team. We don't hold the hand, give advice, help push the paperwork along, get them into the country, meet them at the airport. We're not service-based. What we do as far as the refugees, and really kind of applies to all the work we do, Brian, if I can call you Brian.
Yes, sir.
Is that, we got, for like the refugees, we want to point out whether they're in this country or in, Central Europe or wherever they are, that their human rights are fall as they go there and as they move around or go back or repatriated or, whatever happens in these, very challenging situations.
Right.
The way we do that, though, is a really, we're eyes on the ground. We have Human Rights Watch type situation where we report on what's happening. We have monitors at the borders and certain, ports and facilities, and we listen to other charity, groups that are trying to help. And when abuses, and they happen, we bring them to light and encourage other groups, entities, legal groups, governments to kind of change their practices or to help fit that in. But, Brian, we don't actually have a number you can call to get, the paperwork and anything done in a sense like that. It's real grassroots and, idea-oriented.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you say that because I just got off the phone with the UN like a couple hours ago. And I was talking to someone. He wasn't actually in the Human Rights Department. He was in like the Refugee Department. I guess they're the ones that do.
Brian?
Yeah. I didn't really actually get his name. I don't know. I talked to the guy for like 20 minutes, and I didn't actually get his name. But he gave me a lot of really useful information. But what I found interesting about everything he was saying was that both you and the UN, you don't really have any kind of a formal procedure where someone can just download something and put in a complaint and be guaranteed to get some kind of a response and a caseworker and someone that's going to start working with them and call them in for a meeting and all that. It just seems very kind of like helter-skelter, like they just kind of like, okay, well, you call up and we'll see what we do and all this kind of stuff. Is there a reason why they don't have a formal procedure for filing complaints? I mean, it seems...
My understanding, Brian, is that there is. If you talk to, I don't know, the UN is a huge, there's non-governmental government, it's a huge bureaucracy.
Yeah, I know. My taxes help to pay for the $8 billion we gave them.
Yeah, it's disproportionate. You could give me, unofficially, I've got a lot of thoughts on, it's a good idea that's gone anywhere from wrong to horribly wrong in a lot of ways.
What has happened? They just seem very ineffectual. Like you guys, like talking to you guys, you just seem so much more like in touch with it. You see, like when you talk to the UN, it's almost kind of like, I can imagine if one of my Syrian refugee students were to call them up and they talk to them like that, they'd be like, oh my God, like these people are impersonal. And every time I've talked to them, because I've been doing research for 8 months on this dissertation, which I just finished, and every time I talk to them, it's kind of the same. They're just very bland and like they don't know and they don't know what to do, and it's so surprising to me because you would think the UN would be the one place you could call and they would just be like, "Yup, we'll take care of it," but they don't. They don't really have a procedure either.
Millions of others are disabused of that notion, unfortunately. But the UNHCR, the United Nations High Commission on Refugees, I believe they do have. It's a little bureaucratic, but they do have a way to would they take it, a complaint or whatever. I don't represent UNHCR, but I used to give to them and learned quite a bit about them.
Okay.
They designate who's a refugee, and then they have other organizations or entities help from there. So they are bureaucratic and they are logistical, and they work with such desperate situations. I kind of almost don't blame them for getting kind of a callus on their shoulder. One of the things that the jobs that the people do there, they've got a little paper bracelet they put on your wrist, Brian.
Yeah.
And it's got green, yellow, and red. You might have heard about it, but if they put that thing around your wrist and you're a certain age or whatever, they have a calculation. They say, hey, you're too far gone. You're not worth giving food because, hey, there's people in this line that have a chance of living, but you really don't.
Oh, I know. Well,
it has to deal with that on a day in and day out basis.
Well, yeah, I mean that's what it reminds. You know what it really reminds me of from America. I don't mean to cut you off. I just wanted to kind of interject this because it was a perfect place to. Is that this reminds me so much of American history and the idea of Bentham. Jeremy Bentham and utilitarianism and the best for the common good, and it seems kind of like it is that way, but that worries me because I think, like in my research, what we just found out, by the way, it came from the University of Nottingham, which is like the #2 education research university in the United Kingdom, aside from Oxford. So quite a good school, a lot of really good researchers working there. And this dissertation did get a distinction on it, so apparently, I don't know, they thought it was at least passable. But anyway, what I came up with is that the two important factors for these refugees coming over here is that they can be put in communities, very, really tight-knit learning communities where they're together all day and they learn to work as a group. They learn to help each other and teach each other and do things with each other and complete tasks together. And these are all different, nationalities. So maybe some of these people come from Syria, some come from Iraq, some come from Mexico, whatever. And so the two important things were being able to, work in a group and then also teaching them to be self-sufficient. Seems to be very kind of logical, rational information to emerge from the data. And I was really surprised. I was like, that's really cool that from all these variables, I came up with just two. It factored down to just two, and that was it. Self-reliance and being able to work in a group. And so it's this kind of idea of having a learning community where people are really close-knit. But what worries me is if you're going to put students in that kind of a learning community, where they're really kind of like tied down, like they're really, really invested, and they can't just say, I don't like this school, I'm going to leave, because they're part of the group,
Sure.
What happens if they start having a bad situation? Now they can't, if they're having a really dire situation, they're afraid to say, I don't like this program, I don't like the people on it, we're not getting along, or whatever. They don't want to go to the police, maybe. They don't want to, because it's too serious, and they don't know what to say because their English isn't good, so they don't know what to say to the police. And they just really don't know who to talk to. And as a foreigner in a foreign country, I always think of the embassy or the UN or whatever. And it surprised me that there's no number for them to call. There's no standard procedure. So as far as you guys go, what would happen if a refugee called you and said, okay, I have a problem? What would the procedure be from that point?
Well, first of all, I find out, if there's thousands of problems that we all face as refugees, even the simple problems are worse. They're just many more times intense. But basically, if there's a human rights violation that we believe is happening, in other words, the refugees are putting in a holding camp where they don't have access to sanitation or water or whatnot, we send, or we invite them, really, Brian, is what we do. We invite them to lodge a complaint or report with the International Secretariat, which goes back to what you said as far as having an outside body that, can look into another country that's not influenced by the government, the machinations that happen in every country pretty much, especially big ones. So we'd say, hey, we want you to email the International Secretariat. Basically, it's amnesty.org, UK, United Kingdom.
Oh, you guys are UK, huh?
Well, we're worldwide, but if something happens in the UK, they refer it to another country to have outside influence. So anything that happens in the U.S., we send it to, just if it happened in the U.S., we send it to the UK to have them evaluate it and make sure we're not duplicating requests. Because, again, we're a small group. We can't help. We can provide a bigger impact by Brian. There's a group that the UNHCR works with, I believe. This is a few years ago, but called the International Rescue Committee. Have you heard about them? They've been around since the 30s.
1930s International Refugee Committee.
The International Rescue Committee.
Oh, Rescue.
I think they're at
Rescue
rescue.org.
Committee. Okay, gotcha. Yep. Okay. No, I haven't heard of them. What are they about?
Well, it was Einstein's idea to come up with them in 36, and they've been around under a couple of different names, basically the same name since 1950. And
Cool.
they're really a holistic. They're from harm to home. They're one of the first people on the scene with the refugees. They have logistics and support. They work with a lot of Doctors Without Borders, CARE, Feed the Children. They do a lot of logistics. I've been participating with them. What I think you should do is, one, you could call back the UNHCR and make sure you're talking to someone who, is in the refuge, I forget the right term of it, but there's somebody is there that can handle complaints for refugees. They're going to be bureaucratic, but they're there.
Okay.
The next thing I'd do is I'd call the International Rescue Committee, and I'd actually call their New York office and tell them, what you're doing, and see if you can wrap with somebody like me. It'd probably be similar, but they'd even have a lot more information, I honestly would say, because rather than our grassroots activism, bringing it to attention and, trying to get the media involved and governments involved, they're there in person. They're right on the lines.
I mean, I kind of like the personal idea, and I'm sure that a lot of times they can kind of, maybe the problem is not so big, it's a misunderstanding. They can dispel it very quickly in just a short conversation. There's no need for paperwork. But what I wonder about is, what would happen if, for example, you had a refugee woman? Oftentimes they're marginalized. They're made to stay at home. They won't be allowed to take English. They won't be allowed to join the group. Now, if a woman like that wanted to contact someone, she's not going to be able to leave her home and go down to the building, and she's probably not even going to be able to make a phone call. She'd be lucky if she could, talk to someone for a few minutes and have them start the paperwork or find a way to something like that. Or if there was some paperwork that was readily available that was disseminatable to all the refugees. If any of them had a problem, they could just carry it with them. And if they had a problem, they just fill it out and send it in, boom, into the mailbox, or give a phone call, and you can guarantee you can talk to someone. That's the kind of thing I think they need. And I've just been thinking about it today because I'm thinking, if you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the first thing you need is safety. And I worry that when they come here, this country is so different from where they live, and the people are so diverse, and they're going to be put into a culture and a society they totally don't understand our customs or our language.
Yeah.
It's so much to deal with.
Hear you.
And if they're nervous at the same time, they don't feel like they have a very easy way to just fill something out, send it in, and get a response, then that's going to put a lot of pressure on them. And I was just wondering if the reason I was calling is not to suggest it, but I was just wondering if there is any kind of a package or paper or anything.
Well, I don't know. For one, these are some of I think you'll agree, these are some of the toughest problems out there, just very, very complex and sad and tough. But what the IRC does is, one, they put people in communities. I live by an area where they have a bunch of Tibetans because I live in a mountainous region, and the Tibetans started here, so other than LA, there's lots of Tibetans. And when the refugees come, they have, I'm not using the terms that they use. I don't know what they're called exactly, but, they have a buddy.
Uh-huh.
And usually that buddy either comes from that country or a real neighboring country that's a similar language and stuff like that. So they've got that. And usually there's, some places you've got to start with one or two, but then you develop a community. And I'm not talking about ghettos, but I'm talking about, people that can go to church or, have support groups and stuff like that.
Right. Yeah. And that's actually what the UN was saying quite a bit of, is that they say, they're better off to go through their local school or their church group or their faith-based group or whatever,
right,
or their community group or whatever is around, because the way that it sounded to me with the UN is they're so high up and they're so big that they can't handle individual cases like that or something. But the thing that bothers me is
they don't have. That's right.
But I mean, what
I think if you're a teacher, I think you can have. There's this method A, B, C, D. Basically, what it boils down to, I think, is that it's human contact and really just reaching out and making a difference. How does this person communicate? What do they need in their day-to-day life? And I think that's awesome. But again, Brian, that isn't our forte and hasn't been. We're really just in the marketplace of ideas, I guess you might say.
Okay, all right. So if a
thing I
refugee,
want to say is we're a little.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I just want do you know of any organizations that are more streamlined like that for to just accept complaints and then somehow are able to work with organizations or is it just or do they just not exist?
I think what they do is I think they're out there, but I'm not sure they're specialized. There's the Travelers Aid Societies, church groups, the AC, groups that protect civil rights and stuff like that. Okay. But I don't think there's an umbrella. And I like your idea. A forum like it could say everywhere there's a school or something. There could be, hey, refugees. If you're a refugee and you need some, we could reach out. You could anonymously put your concern or complaint or question in a box or email it somewhere where that you wouldn't be put in danger or shame for asking that question. You could get some help. It's a great idea. We're not there yet as far as I know, though, Brian.
All right. So let's just say in the case that one of my students did have a problem and they said, okay, teacher, I need to do something. What would the best first line be for them, aside from the church groups? If they didn't have a church group or they didn't have anywhere to go and they just felt like they didn't have anyone in the U.S. around them for some reason that they could contact to help them. I mean, who knows? People get into trouble sometimes. They get into trouble with who knows what. So.
Yeah. They might need, this depends on the circumstances, Brian. If it's the legal issue, they might need a lawyer, they might need a pro bono. If it's a real personal matter, then they need a confidant or a mentor or a buddy type system. I don't work in that day-to-day enough to know what the answer is, although I'm passionate about it, but I don't know what the answer is on that one, Brian.
I know it.
But my next step for you would be to maybe I'd call IRC or email them or something, and then maybe get back with UNHCR and make sure, in a big bureaucracy like that, the chances that you're going to get the right person on the phone on the first call are pretty slim.
Oh, yeah. It's so true. The guy I talked to was not even in that department, really, but he had quite a bit of information. He was quite knowledgeable. But he had a lot of trouble answering very simple questions, which is strange because I was asking him the same thing I asked you. And it's funny because I got a very straight answer from you. I said, is there a streamlined process? And you said no. And I had to ask this guy 8 times if there's any kind of streamlined process or paper. He just kept avoiding it. And I was like, why are you avoiding the question? I don't understand why you would avoid it. If you don't have a process, right? If it's not in your charter or if it's not in your protocol to allow that kind of paperwork to be processed at your level, then why not just say that? Like, we're too big, we don't do that kind of paperwork. They have to go through Amnesty or smaller organizations, which, by the way, they have told me before. They have directed me to you before. Okay, to Amnesty. Because when I asked them the same question, they said, oh, yeah, you should call Amnesty International but then I said, but Amnesty is like, I don't know, I assumed Amnesty was an American-based place, and so I said, well, that wouldn't work in America. But you said they're actually headquartered in the UK, is it right?
Most of, I think my last time, there's about 5 million members worldwide, and like 1.8 are in the U.S., so we are based in, the International Secretariat's based in the UK. Of course, we're working all over the world, but the USA, proud to say, is, very active and a big part of it.
Cool. All right. Well, I'll tell you what. I'll go on your website and I'll just give you guys my email, and maybe I'll even send you a copy of my dissertation in case anyone's interested in education papers. It's kind of, whatever. It's just a master's dissertation, but it's interesting. And and if I can do anything for you guys, I'll let you know.
Keep faith. Keep working hard, Brian.
Thanks, but we all have to keep working hard for him because it's a bad situation over there, and I don't know. I just tend to.
Too, in one sense,
It really is, and I just tend to be of the opinion that if you look at the chart, if you look at the description of human rights in the United Nations, actual description, they say it's about something about brotherhood or something like that, and I'm thinking, if America wants to really be a brother to the Syrians, what would you do if your brother was being attacked by an army? Would you say you can't come over to my house? Of course you wouldn't. You'd say come over, right? And I kind of wonder why the United States has not taken a bigger position on that. Like, just say, look, just come over here. We have smart people to look after and make sure they're not terrorists or whatever. We'll get them into community program, get them working. They'll be good members of the community. What is the problem? And it just seems like, do you think, from your perspective, have you heard anything about, like, people being racist against the refugees from Syria or any other war-torn countries, being mean, being disrespectful?
General, there's, hey, we got a cloud of xenophobia that's hard to shake off. No, not real horror situations.
Yeah, the cloud of
Not really.
The cloud of xenophobia, courtesy of Donald, right? Poor Donald.
Well, he's a poster boy for it, but yeah, it's pretty deep seated, unfortunately.
All right, I didn't mean to get you into politics there, but it was fun.
It's all good, man.
All right,
all good.
hey, thanks a lot
I'm gonna go take some more phone calls.
All right, great, man. Thanks so much for your help. All right, bye bye.